First of all, want to welcome everyone and thanks for joining us for a conversation with Margaret Heffernan. I'm Adam Bryant, Managing Director of the Exco Group, and I have the honor of interviewing Margaret for this session, which is great because I always learn a ton whenever I talk to her, and I'm confident you will too. Margaret, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. It's really nice to be talking to you again, Adam.
That's great. I don't want to take up too much time for the introduction because if I went through your whole resume, Margaret, I'd still be talking 30 minutes from now. She's an entrepreneur, a veteran CEO, a hugely popular TED speaker, author of many books, including her latest, Uncharted, How to Navigate the Future, which we're going to be talking about today. And if you want to learn more about Margaret, be sure to check out her website, mheffernan.com. I've got that right, don't I, Margaret?
You certainly do.
Great. I also want to thank everyone for the questions you submitted in advance, and I'll be getting to many of those over the course of the hour, which I'm certain is going to fly by. So with that, let's get started. And I always like to begin at the beginning. So Margaret, where did you get the idea for this book, Uncharted?
Well, I think I got it pretty much the same way I've got the idea for most of my books, which is something happens or someone says something and I pay attention and then it won't let me alone. Now, bear in mind, I probably have an idea every week for a book and I ignore those ideas because if I forget them, then it shows they're not worthy of attention.
Right.
And in the case of this one, I was picking my daughter up from a friend's house and the mother said to me as I was leaving, you know, if I knew I was going to live to be 95, I'd drink more. And I thought this is so funny because, you know, it was a perfect articulation of a paradox, which is, of course, if she drank more, she definitely wouldn't live to be 95, you know. And it just stuck in my head because I thought it was funny and I like paradoxes. But it made me start thinking about the strange, rather magical ways that we tend to think about the future. And then, as a good idea does, it acts as a sort of magnet among the iron filings of one's existence, and all sorts of other things kind of coalesced around it. And I started thinking a little bit more deeply about how do we think about the future and how many people think about it as linear and some people don't. And really, that's what got the ball rolling, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I've been through the pain of writing a few books myself. I'm intrigued by what you said. You sort of have the idea and it sounds like you sort of let it go. And then if it comes back to you again, so what's your test? Like it's got to come back to you 3 times or something? Or at what point do you sort of say, oh, this is definitely a book and I have to do this?
Well, it's partly it won't let me alone. It's partly that I look, you know, I do research and I look in bookstores and I don't see anything that answers the question that has been provoked. It's probably, and this is going to sound a tad arrogant, it's partly that I hear people pontificating on the subject and think, I don't think so. So it's a sort of sense that there's something somewhere that matters to people, because otherwise I wouldn't keep noticing it. But I can't find a very good answer to it. And this was definitely true in Willful Blindness. It was definitely true for A Bigger Prize. And it was definitely true for Uncharted. And that sounds kind of fun and nice. And then there's a kind of, so that's the fun part, right? You think, okay, I'm definitely onto something. And then you start really digging in and you realize why nobody's written about it, which is A, it's super hard, and B, because mostly people have written simple answers that are wholly insufficient. So now you know, okay, this is a great opportunity. It's very similar to being an entrepreneur. It's a great opportunity. All the bad books show there's a market. And so you have the optimism of thinking, well, if there's a market of curiosity, then I could probably do something better.
Yeah.
And as I say, I think it's a lot like being an entrepreneur because, you know, I advise a lot of entrepreneurs when they're doing their business plan and they're doing their competitive analysis. If they say nobody's in this market, I say, either you haven't done your research, right? Or you don't want to be in this market if nobody's there, right?
Right.
You want some people to soften it up and get it wrong before you go in with your magical solution. So it's a similar kind of horizon scanning and sense making process, I think, that entrepreneurs have. And on some level, each book is some kind of mini business, really.
Yeah, yeah. And part of being an entrepreneur is, there's a little bit of luck and timing involved, and your timing could not be better.
Well, I think with Uncharted, it couldn't have been better. Willful Blindness and A Bigger Prize were both ahead of their time. The good news about that is they continue to sell really well a significant period of time after they were written. Sadly, my book about, women's careers, written in 2004 and 2007, are as relevant now as they ever were. I really wish they were obsolete.
Right.
So, I have garnered a reputation for being ahead of my time, which is great for my reputation, not so great for my publishers. But with Uncharted, to be fair, I guess you could say I was lucky. I wish I hadn't been. If it was a choice between book sales and a pandemic,
yes, of course.
I'd really rather not have had the pandemic.
Right, right. But the timing is remarkable. I mean, pre-pandemic, at the risk of stating the obvious, I mean, the business world in many ways ran on the opposite of Uncharted, which is like, we are charting the future. And, the whole idea of like the glossy business magazine cover with the CEO with their arms folded across their chest, like, I see the future. Yeah, exactly. And I've sat in plenty of meetings where somebody's got like the spreadsheets out 10 years down to the last penny. So talk a little bit about sort of the ethos, the thinking, the confidence in being able to chart the future pre-pandemic versus what we're living through now.
Well, I think, in many ways, really, since the Industrial Revolution, we've had this kind of model of business, which is forecast, plan, execute, and a belief that everything that mattered could be measured. And if you put those two beliefs together, you could do perfect forecasts and therefore perfect planning. And then if you really had your act together, you could do perfect execution, and then you'd be a superstar. And I think it's Roger Martin who wrote very perceptively about both Microsoft and GE that did this so well that they adhered to their plans with kind of microscopic detail to a degree that is statistically implausible. And I'll, leave that to people listening to figure out, so what was really going on? What was really going on was not the market. It was not the business. It was actually kind of micromanaging a dialogue between the market and the spreadsheet. Right. That meant everything worked out perfectly, which is not quite real life. But anyway, I think what all of that did is it persuaded us that if we were great leaders, we could always hit a bullseye. And this was hugely exacerbated by the spinners of Silicon Valley, who argued, well, if you have enough data, the data will give you the whole story. And then you're really on top of your game. And there are a whole bunch of problems with this. One is that companies that everybody regarded with significant respect didn't always get it right, or companies people respected got it too right for comfort. Another was that, certainly the economic crisis gave us a bit of a shock. And also all kinds of companies that had been really good started becoming not very good and failing. And so you thought, well, what's changed? And so I think there were lots of early warning signs that this forecast, plan, execute wasn't working. And then you had scholars like Philip Tetlock starting to study the forecasting process. And, what Tetlock proved very elegantly was that, first of all, forecasting is a much more rigorous process than is seen in most businesses. So it requires a very, very broad range of information sources to inform it. It requires that you always assign probabilities to your forecast and you keep tuning them in the light of new information. So forecasting isn't, a kind of once a quarter thing. It is an ongoing mental cognitive exercise. And then after the event, you go back and analyze what you got wrong and why. If you do all of that, which very few companies do on such a rigorous basis, they show that the window for accurate forecasting is approximately 400 days. And if you aren't as rigorous as that, which most companies aren't, then it's closer to 150 days. And this is another one of these things. I have a bit of an appetite for nerdy data points. It just stuck in my head and I kept thinking, but hang on a second. If that's true, that changes everything. And then I started talking to people, like General Stan McChrystal, who was deeply aware of how much uncertainty had infiltrated certainly the world of the military. That whereas in the past, forecast, plan, execute had been their core strength. It's why the first Iraq war was so successful. But now he was operating in a field where a kid with a cell phone could change the whole game. And I thought it was a really beautiful metaphor for the old model of certainty and prediction and the new model of complexity. And I think that very few individuals or organizations pre-pandemic had really taken this on board. And so when I was writing, the opening salvo, if you like, in Uncharted, saying how unpredictable the world was, I did feel, like all my other books, I had a bit of an uphill battle here. And then the pandemic came along and we just had a visceral lived experience of this, because let's be clear, there have always been epidemics throughout history. There's no evidence, there's never been any suggestion that we've got rid of this. But the nature of an epidemic is, they're going to happen. So that's bad news. But it's certain on some level. But you don't know what the pathogen's going to be. You don't know where it's going to start. And you don't know when it's going to start. So this is the worst of all possible worlds. Something bad's going to happen, but there's no detail. That's kind of the essence of uncertainty. It's not wildly dissimilar from climate change, which is, we know it's real, but we can't predict next summer where there are going to be forest fires or which parts of agricultural land will be flooded with consequences for food supply. So we know we're in the middle of this very, very crucial crisis, but we can't plan for it because there's too much ambiguity and uncertainty around it. And I thought, well, then that's the new world we now have to get used to and adapt our thinking to fit.
Yeah. There's been a lot of silver linings through the horrible tragedy of this pandemic. But it does feel to me like once the pandemic hit, there was a sense among sort of leaders and organizations where everybody said, can we just all stop pretending that we know what's actually happening? Like, let's stop with the confidence game. Nobody knows, and we're all just doing our best. Do you think this is going to have lasting consequences, or do you think once we get beyond this pandemic, the Delta variant, that people are going to go back to the confidence, I see the future crystal ball stuff?
Well, I think the magical thinking about I see the future is so comforting that it does exert a gravitational pull. I think that's unfortunate. What my friends in epidemiology and immunology, and, bear in mind the advantage, but also the handicap of being married to an immunologist, is that in our failure to vaccinate the world, we are creating a breeding ground for variants. And so the sense that we have, which I would like to share, that, we're getting out of the woods now, I think is pretty fragile. But I do get a sense that people are starting to think, oh, phew, we're out of it. Now, what I think is sad about that is not that I don't want to be out of it. I want to be out of it. Really desperately want to be out of it.
Of course.
Is I think we're in such a race to get out of it that we're failing to absorb some of the really great lessons we learn. I mean, there are a lot of companies around the world that, faced by this huge shock, adapted quite brilliantly. And these are big companies and small companies. And they found inside themselves and their people a capacity for creativity and innovation and improvisation that they didn't know they had. And if we forget that, then that's a huge waste, because that's what we have to build on. I mean, I chair a company here in the UK and I had just started chairing it. I mean, literally just started chairing it when the pandemic broke out. So I haven't met most of my board members yet. I haven't met most of the senior leadership team yet. And yet in the first 6 months, they completely rewrote the business strategy and the financial plan. And they have executed against that very, very well. And they're not reverting to the norm. They're thinking, okay, it's important we remember this, and we have to think about where did it come from, and how do we make sure we don't lose that capacity, and who are the people who are really great at it, and who are the people who actually, when it starts to rain, they run indoors, which isn't to say they're useless, but you have to put them in certain areas and not others. So my fear is, and I think this happens much more in business than we like to talk about, that we have failed to milk the success stories as well as the failure stories. And I say the success stories because, Bill Gates is famous for saying success is a bad teacher. And it's a bad teacher because we make gigantic attribution errors, right? Like, the reason the company was successful was because of its heroic CEO, or right, because of one super cool CTO or inventor or whatever. Actually, explaining success is always quite intricate and complex, and you can never prove it. We are a little more fastidious, I think, about examining failures, partly because sometimes we're looking for scapegoats, but also we also realize, well, we better learn from this, or we might repeat it. But I think in the case of the pandemic, we have both success and failure to learn from. And so if we fall for this happy ever after kind of Hollywood ending, then I think that'll be a tragic waste of a really painful experience.
Yeah.
Because I have seen CEOs and senior leadership teams just so outperform their own expectations of themselves. And I've seen others so completely miss the point. And so I think, like all intense experiences, there's a lot to be learned from it. If we can just slow down a second and delve into the learning before it kind of fades away.
Yeah. No, I'd love to build on that point too, because it's a conversation that we're having with a lot of leaders inside different companies. I mean, especially sort of big legacy companies, there's literally decades of muscle memory of that sort of plan, execute on an agile, and then they go through the pandemic and they, as you say, like, let's embrace imperfection and innovation and speed and figure out how to do something rather than to find the 20 reasons not to do something. Yeah. And so they're sort of saying like, wow, look at what we did. Right. So now it feels to me like one of the big challenges is like, how do you systematize that? So it doesn't just fade as a new muscle you just built. Right. So, that's an on-ramp to the big question is like, how do you operationalize this sort of uncharted, navigating an uncertain future mindset?
Yeah. And it's a really good and deeply complex question, because I think if you say, okay, so what we did in that moment of crisis is how we should work all the time, I'm not convinced that's the right thing to do. For one thing, it needs a crisis to get people to that point. For another thing, we know that people are exhausted. And we also know from the rather magisterial Microsoft Global Work Trends report that while people at the top of organizations generally did really, really well in all aspects, people at the bottom half of the organization really suffered. All the marginalized groups did badly, women, ethnic minorities, the lower echelon. And we know that that's geographically true too. So again, I think the business world is always on the lookout for frameworks and recipes that promise eternal glory. And I'm always deeply skeptical of those. And I'm also quite skeptical of Agile, because Agile has become a kind of fancy word for quick. And I think, I really like quick, but it'll only get you so far because it's highly incremental. And I think that one of the things that happened in the pandemic is many people had a super clear idea of really on a very deep fundamental level, what are we here for? So in the UK, for example, the healthcare system, which is just burdened by the most enormous bureaucracy in the universe, threw it all off their shoulders and said, actually, we're here to do the right thing for the patient. So we don't really care what the rules are. We don't really care what the hierarchy is. We're just going to do what's going to be right, what's right for the patient. And in that found a clarity and effectiveness and speed that no amount of Agile coaches and workshops and collaboration had ever delivered. And I think I've heard much the same from other companies. So I think there's a really fascinating paradox, which is it's in the nature of a crisis that it often brings enormous clarity around what are we doing this for and why does it matter, which has become embraced under the rubric of purpose. But, purpose, like every word adopted by the business community, loses meaning almost the minute it hits the title page, right?
Right.
And I think, what if I were still running companies, what I would take from this is this paradox, which is that in a time of enormous disruption and volatility and ambiguity and unpredictability, what matters more than ever is your long-term, if not eternal, sense of why you matter. And if people truly, truly, truly understand that, and this goes way beyond purpose-laden taglines, then in the moment they do know what to do. But if the sense of meaning in the business is phony or half-baked, they won't. And so I think we're in this very difficult, strange moment where we have to be able to think fast on our feet, but within a context which is quite sturdy and deeply rooted. And the organizations I've seen that have functioned well in this period have navigated that paradox with quite a lot of clarity and elegance.
Have so many different questions. I mean, the topic of purpose is one that has come up a lot, right, in the pandemic. And there was that piece the other week about how more companies are appointing a chief purpose officer. Have you seen that? And I like the way you framed it, which is just this sort of having clarity around why you matter, right? And with some organizations, it's easier to point to an answer, like if you're in the healthcare space, like you're helping patients, right? If there's a very clear line to actually helping people. Other companies, it's a little bit more of a challenge. Like if I'm making ball bearing for truck wheels, like on the CEO, how do I
Yeah.
how do I answer that question about why we matter? Like, I know
Yeah.
we matter because we build a good quality product that helps our customers and that helps other people. But how do you address that conversation?
Yeah. Well, I think you make a really good point, because you do see some immense silliness on this subject, right?
Right.
As well as some spectacular waffle. I mean, there's a big bank here that I think it says its purpose is to help Britain prosper.
Right.
I mean, I haven't faintest idea what that means. But I think you make a good point, which is it doesn't fall to every company in the universe to have this great lofty purpose. But I think it can have a sense as to what are the things we care about that we want to honor no matter what. So if I'm in the ball bearings company, I might want to honor the principle that I will deliver to my customers products that will never let them down.
Yeah.
I might deliver to my workforce a working environment that is healthy and safe, and I won't let them down on that. I might deliver to the community that I belong to a contribution that makes them proud that my company is in their community and a vibrant, respected part of that community. But if I start saying that I'm making the world a better place by making the greatest ball bearings in the universe, I mean, it sounds great, but I just wonder when everybody comes into work on Monday morning, does it mean anything?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think, however one defines purpose, I think it has to be kind of real and tangible and lived.
Yeah.
So, do what's right for the patients is very real and tangible and lived, but it has to be something people feel they can do, even in the face of bean counters. Yeah. And if they can't do it in the face of bean counters, then don't say it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the whole idea of purpose, you may have seen that episode in the HBO series Silicon Valley where they skewered this, all these entrepreneurs took turns on stage describing their companies, and all of them at the end, really arcane technology said, and make the world a better place. And it just sort of one after another. So
yeah,
we've seen that movie before. Another theme that has really come up during the pandemic from all our conversations with CEOs and other leaders is that this pandemic really kind of separated people and in many ways reordered how boards and companies saw the leadership team, succession candidates, and the story we often hear is like the high performing stars beforehand that the company was planning on betting on long term. They didn't show up well, kind of lost their voice, and sometimes the quieter people just said, really found their voice and stepped up and just made the most of the opportunity. So all that's context for my question for you and for everybody who's joining us right now. Like at an individual level, what can each of us do to operate better in this sort of incredibly uncertain and ambiguous environment? What's the mindset we all need to have? What can we do?
Well, I think the first thing is not to assume that your lived experience is generalizable. I mean, certainly one of the things we've learned through the pandemic is everybody's had a different experience. And the poster child for that is probably Bill Michaels at KPMG, who had a perfectly fine time and started screaming at his employees to stop moaning, and thereby demonstrated that he was profoundly out of touch. It's human nature to think that my experience is everybody's experience, but in this situation, it's never been more wrong. So I think the first thing is don't make that assumption, and therefore ask questions and listen to people. And it's interesting, I chair the board of a company where I was talking to the CEO about the whole return to work stuff. And of course, the company was doing surveys. And I said, oh, please don't do surveys. Please don't do surveys. You're going to get numbers and you're going to think they mean something, and you're going to make decisions on the basis of the numbers, and you're not going to know anything. Please convene groups of employees and ask them good questions and turn up and listen. And the CEO came back to me and said, "Oh my God, I'm so glad you said that, because what I heard was so far from anything we would even have asked." I mean, both the spectrum of experiences, the quality of the experience, how people had redefined and adjusted their sense of what work was for and what they wanted from it. And all of that qualitative nuance doesn't show up as 67%, no matter how well you design the survey. And so, so I think the first thing to do is don't generalize from your own experience, and don't think the numbers will tell you everything. They quite often tell you nothing. I remember when I was running tech companies in the US, and my chairman, who was absolutely brilliant individual, was a superb mathematician. I mean, frighteningly superb. And I remember saying to him once, you are invested in about 40 different businesses. How do you know what's going on in them? And he said, "I just look at the numbers." And I thought, okay, fair enough. You're such a brilliant mathematician. Maybe you can do it. I mean, I can't do it, but maybe you can. And he definitely couldn't. I mean, there were definitely things going on in some of those businesses. The numbers never showed until after the businesses failed. And I'm not against numbers, which is why I'm dazzled by brilliant mathematicians, right? But that there's a limit to what they can show you. And they will never show you something you haven't asked about, which is almost definitely the thing that you most need to know. So learn how to convene meaningful groups of people, how to ask good questions, and then how to shut up and listen. And I think in my mentoring, I would say I've seen the most transformational change among my clients, and not in their capacity to think, which they always did brilliantly, but their ability to listen, which meant they started thinking about different things in different ways. So I think that's really important. I think I'm very interested by what you say about how, rising stars suddenly don't look to be rising so fast anymore.
Right.
In a couple of companies where I'm mentoring the CEO currently, the decision has been reached that the rising stars don't have what's needed now, and that they have to go a generation or a level below that. That they need younger people, not for their youth, but for their open-mindedness, I would say, and for their ability to question and try stuff, so that they're less comfortable and less anxious about pursuing comfort, and more creative and more connected to a wider range of disciplines. And I think one of the most interesting things I've seen in a wide range of companies or organizations, both private and public sector, is the emergence of what some companies are calling a shadow board, which is made up of generally people under their 30s that are addressing the same questions as the board and sharing their recommendations and thoughts with the board. And this is, in some cases, this is driven by an attempt to rectify intergenerational injustice. In some case, it's a kind of humble recognition that the board may not understand the capabilities of new technology as well as a younger generation. In some cases, it's where diversity works better, frankly, because that's how that generation has grown up. And what's so fascinating about it is that it's both probably the finest kind of executive education that young generation could get, because it's real world, real time. It's fantastic executive education for the board, but it's developing a fine quality of discussion, debate, and exploration. And I think it's a really fantastic innovation. And I mean, I would recommend it. Every company does it in a slightly different way, but I think when we have so much uncertainty and perspectives are so wildly divergent, it's a very good way of doing perspective taking, which you have to do if you're going to make decisions with big consequences, which are regarded as being legitimate. And I think for governments, as for corporations, this issue of legitimacy is a burning issue. In whose name, on what grounds are we going to do this? And I think it's one of the most interesting developments I've seen.
Yeah, that's great. If you could imagine a 30-something young executive, super ambitious, has their eyes on the world and is always trying to get better, sort of a, self-improvement junkie. And they were on this call and they said, Margaret, like, I want to be good at this because I understand how important it is. What can I do just on a daily basis? Because let's face it, why human beings are wired to love certainty, right?
Yeah.
And we're all kind of creatures of habit, and we want, the same Starbucks at the same place every time of day. So what can I do on a day? Like, what habits, what can I do to build those muscles so that I am more comfortable in ambiguity and uncertainty?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. I mean, there's, again, we're back in the land of paradox. I would say, your taste for routine, don't undermine it. Routine can make us very effective. I have, a lot of routines when I'm writing. I write with a very rigid routine. I really am very happy with routine. It shuts off lots of questions I don't want to be distracted by.
Right.
But I would say on certain days or certain times, throw it out, just break your habits, partly so you don't become so rigid as to depend on them,
right,
and partly to learn something new. So, I tend to be, or I try to be, a very organized person. I tend to be very, very busy. So I like to get my logistics as nailed down as humanly possible so I don't have to worry about them. I sometimes drive my family mad in doing that, but it's what's allowed me to do a lot. But when I go on vacation, or if I do something over the weekend, I do pretty deliberately throw all of that out the window. So let's go to, the other day I went to Siena, and I had to be there a day early for various boring logistical reasons. And I thought, I'm not going to research where I'm going to eat. I'm not going to research what I'm going to see. I'm going to step out of my hotel room and just wander around. And this is not the way I do Monday to Friday.
right.
And what happens? Well, it's what always happens. You're much more alert. All your senses are firing up. You notice all kinds of stuff, and you feel whole parts of your brain that were slightly dormant before really firing on all cylinders. And no, I couldn't do as much work in that condition as I did today. But certain kinds of work, that's the only way I can do it. And I need to have both of those capabilities. So I would say definitely have routines, and then have the capacity to smash them. And I think it sometimes drives my family nuts that I do that when they aren't quite expecting it, right? But I think it's essential, because then when somebody, you look at your calendar and you think, right, I know what I'm doing every day for the next 6 months. And then as, March 2020, it all gets thrown out the window. Instead of trying to retrieve it, I just thought, okay, so that's all out the window. So what do we do instead? And I launched all sorts of different projects and did all kinds of different things, because I was suddenly at a completely different agenda, which is I wanted to be useful.
Yeah.
And I also wanted not to go broke in the meantime. So I was just started working in a different way, with creating different kinds of projects with different kinds of organizations, and also really standing by the people who I felt needed me most. And it's funny, because at first I thought, oh yeah, I can stay home and play the piano and practice my Italian. But, really seriously, I was never going to be able to resist the lure of being useful in a time of need. But I worked in a completely different way. And I think that while I wouldn't like to live like that forever, I'm very glad to know that, which I didn't know before, I'm really good in a crisis. It doesn't mean I love crises. And I'm quite happy to be getting back to a way of life in which I actually get to see people. But it is very useful to me. It is a strength to me, as it is to any organization, to know that we're really good in a crisis.
Yeah. And I think so much of it is just, it is kind of a mindset, right? Like, do you see that crisis? Do you look for the opportunity in the crisis? And
Yeah.
and to me, I mean, I've interviewed like probably more than 700 leaders at this point, and a couple of hundred of them, maybe 300, have been entrepreneurs. And I think if you ask the question, like, what sets entrepreneurs a little bit apart from everybody else, I think I would go to that answer is like, they don't dwell on the bad news for long, right? It's like, there's got to be something in here somewhere. That was a great story, and it resonates for me personally. The first couple of months in the pandemic, I will confess, I was sort of knocked back on my heels a little bit. And I was interviewing a CEO, and she had this wonderful metaphor, and she said, disruption, she framed it as a physics question. She said, disruption creates energy, it creates motion. So the question is, what are you going to do with that motion?
Yeah.
It's like, got it. And like, literally from that moment, the switch flipped for me, and I just said, okay, how do I make the most of this time?
Yeah. And I think what's interesting, and I think you and I have talked about this before, is I observed a lot of business leaders trying to kind of hack things together in the way that they were roughly the same. And I think they created a lot of drag for their organizations. And I saw other ones just throw all conventional thinking overboard and start again from scratch. And they created a lot of energy in their organizations.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't predict who's going to behave how, but knowing how you yourself as an individual or as a leader will respond is really useful. And in the work that we do in terms of thinking about succession and bearing in mind that, we're in a climate crisis. Even economists can't decide whether we're in an economic crisis or not, right? And we may or may not be in an employment crisis. I think when you're thinking about succession, you really want to be looking for people who are prepared to be deeply elastic in their thinking as the world around them changes. Right. And you want to be really scared of the traditional safe pair of hands. And, I was thinking about this pre-pandemic when I looked at the bloodbath in retail and thinking about how all those safe pairs of hands that kept doing the same thing, cost-cutting, sales, competing with their next door neighbors, they were very, very dangerous leaders, because they would do almost anything other than try something new.
And to that point, I'm imagining somebody sort of mid-level executive in a company who says, in effect, Margaret, I'm like totally on board with everything you're saying. I totally get it. I totally understand the importance of it, but I've got a problem, which is that my boss does not get it. Like, he's still living in a charted world. What would be your advice to that person about like the fine art of managing up?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is I think it's almost impossible to do much effectively in an organization without allies. And this is whether you see a threat that you feel everybody's ignoring, or you see an opportunity that everybody's ignoring, is you have to have some people you can check in with to make sure you're not, hallucinating. And people with whom you can say, okay, so if we're right, what would we be doing? What would be some good, practical options? You have to do that with other people, because you need people to check your own biases and assumptions. And then I think you have to frame it pretty pragmatically. as, we think this could happen, and we think this is happening, and we think we have some options. Because I think really crucial to this, to an unknown future, is any leader who wants to have all kinds of options available to them. And in many ways, I think the job of leadership is to know, okay, if this scenario happens, I can do these 3 things. If that scenario happens, I can do these 4 things, and so on. And so leaders in this phase of, or era of uncertainty and crisis should be searching for options and the people who can provide them. And so instead of marching in as young, bright people are wont to do and say, you're doing everything wrong and you should do this, I think you want to position it as, there are the trends and the weak signals and so on that are suggesting that the road may not be as straight as you imagine. And were that to be the case, we think there's some opportunities here that might make the firm more resilient. So that means it's practical. It's not disruption for its own sake. It's taken into account context. And it's not just one crazy kid trying to make a name for him or herself. Right. And I think it would be an extraordinarily poor leader who'd say, oh, shut up and go back to your day job. And as a CEO, wow, if a group of people came in and made that proposition, I would want to know how I could replicate them, because that's exactly what you want to be doing. And, in Uncharted, I told the story of the chief data officer at Bank of England, who, recognizing that there was going to be more and more data, there would be more and more requests because of more and more regulation for data analysis, could see that the demand on the department was going to increase exponentially, and being a grown-up knew that resources were not going to increase exponentially, and did this super smart thing, which is, instead of retiring to his tent with a hot towel and hoping to come up with a brainwave, ask the entire company, what are the things we should be doing in this context? Where do you think there are kind of air bubbles of locked up productivity that we could release? And was absolutely stunned by many of the proposals and suggestions that came his way. And, we're just starting to see the kind of beginning of open strategy as practiced by many firms around the world, which is this attempt finally to galvanize the collective wisdom of the whole organization, not just an elite few. And I think in pursuit of maximal optionality, this is exactly what CEOs should be encouraging and rewarding in people who have the courage and imagination to present it.
One of the, again, department stating the obvious, but one of the afflictions of a lot of big companies is the gap between the walk and the talk, right? Yeah. And so, some companies may sort of adopt the language of, Uncharted and this new era we're in, and experimentation and fail fast, like all the buzz phrases, and yet all the compensation structures, all the planning and budgeting structures are set up in exact opposite of that. So if that's the case, first of all, do you see that a lot? What should companies do? How do you address that?
Well, I may make myself a little unpopular now. I've always been a little uncomfortable with the way in which we talk about leaders, because, a great deal of my professional life, we didn't talk about leaders. We talked about bosses. There's a big difference between a boss and a leader. And I think we have lots of bosses, and I think we have very few leaders. And the reason I think that is because I see and I work with a lot of people who are in the top spot, but they don't lead. They follow trends, they follow the market, they follow market analysts. but they are never ahead. And they don't really want to be ahead. And actually, many of them temperamentally are afraid of being ahead, because if you're really ahead, you look to the left and right of you, there's nobody there, right? So this is scary. It's pretty cold, and it's very lonely. And so I think it's quite important for individuals to think, well, which am I? And if you're just a boss, that's fine. The world needs good bosses. But don't call yourself a leader, because leaders lead. They are out in front. And I think this is a crucial issue for boards. Do you want to appoint a leader or a boss? And they both have their strengths, right? But I think we use the word leader in a very cavalier way. And I've been lucky to work with quite a lot of fine clients who I think genuinely are leaders, but not an insignificant number of people who aren't. And they're not bad people, and they're almost invariably very smart, experienced people. But my observation about them is they have power when they get to the top, but they are so conditioned to be pleasers that they don't know how to use it. So all of their professional life, they thought, actually, my job is please the person in front of me. And they've done it and done it and done it and done it really, really, really well. And they get to the top of the tree and there really isn't anybody else. And this is the moment they've been waiting for. And that capacity to think for themselves and to break from the crowd has never been developed. Where would it be? They've been developed to be kind of super followers. And it's why, you know, it's such a phenomenal test being a CEO. And I think often boards are rather slack in the way that they think about these appointments. I think people often apply for CEO positions who, if they really think of it as a leadership job, wouldn't really like it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I think we ought to be, I mean, I think in general in business, we mutilate language. But in this case in particular, I think we should be much more careful about what it is we want and what it is we see when we get what we thought we wanted.
Yeah. And we've been talking a lot about paradoxes, which to me, one of the reasons leadership is so hard is because, you know, the hardest parts tend to be paradoxes, right? And
yeah.
You know, to me, one of the toughest paradoxes, like as a leader, you have to show confidence, right? Because people, you know, aren't going to follow somebody who says, like, I'll be honest with you folks, I don't really know, right? Like on the one hand, you have to have confidence. On the other hand, you need to be transparent and open about like what you don't know. So if you were advising a CEO who's about to go to an all hands meeting and, you know, said, Margaret, I need some coaching on like, how do I talk about this in a way that's like inspires confidence, but I'm also acknowledging the uncertainty. What does that talk track sound like? Yeah.
Well, I think the important thing is to know what can you reasonably be very confident about, and what, if you claimed confidence, would you look like an idiot to say you knew for sure. So you know, and I'm thinking about this in my own career. When we started developing software of a kind that, you know, nobody in the world had ever developed, it would have been crazy if I'd said, I know we can do this and I know it's going to work. I mean, everybody would just have thought, yeah, tell that to Marines, you know, really. But what I could say is, I know it's really worth trying. And I know that we have phenomenal people who will give it their best. I could and did say, I know there are going to be days and maybe weeks and maybe, but I hope not months, when we all have really serious doubt whether we should have started this in the first place. But I also know that that's what happens to anybody who tries to do something that's a breakthrough technology. So I can't promise you, and I used to say this to people, when we were recruiting, who'd always ask me the kind of cheesy question, what guarantee can you give me you'll be here 5 years from now? I say, absolutely none. I can't promise we'll be successful. I can promise we have fabulous people. I can promise we'll give it our best. I can promise I will do my level best to make sure we have the resources and the talent that we need. I can promise you it'll be hard. And I can promise you it'll be exhilarating, because no matter what happens, we're all going to learn a phenomenal amount. But I can't promise the outcome, because there's too much. Even if we build it, even if we ship it, even if everybody loves it, there's too much that's outside of my control. And that, I think, is credible enough that people say, okay, fair enough. But actually, if you want the guarantee, you need to go and work somewhere that's doing something a great deal more mundane and dull. And the people who wanted the guarantees, I didn't want to hire them, because I didn't want to spin them a fantasy that, turn up and work for me in a couple of years and you two can retire at the age of 40. I mean, partly I didn't want people who wanted to retire at the age of 40. But also I wasn't prepared to lie to them and say, yeah, sure, we're doing internet technology, and of course it's all going to work, and of course we're all going to make a fortune. I mean, and I definitely didn't want people who'd fall for that.
Margaret, I could talk to you all day, and I know it's getting late in London. The hour has flown by. As I said at the top of the hour, I always learn so much when I talk with you, and didn't disappoint this time either. So thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your insights. There's just so many sort of great quotes and real takeaways from this conversation. So on behalf of everybody on this call, just thank you for your time.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for the great questions, right? Because that's always what provokes a wonderful conversation. And, good luck to everybody who's listening and watching. I mean, it's a tough time, but I have to say, a little bit, as I was saying earlier, I think we've gone through a period where people think, oh, humans are so biased and they have such difficulties and cognitive weaknesses and limitations and stuff. We should just hand it all over to machines. The sheer level of creativity and innovation I've seen in the last 18 months, actually, strangely, paradoxically, makes me a great optimist. I think all the crises that are heading our way are quite daunting. But I think if we really focus and do what we're capable of, we'll get through this, and we will be a lot smarter and a lot more creative as we come out the other end.
I think that's your mic drop moment, Margaret. Again, thanks for your time, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. Really enjoyed this. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.